Hi everyone and welcome to week 11 lecture for Exercise Science 230, which is on the theories of motor control. Now we touched on this a little bit in the first week of this particular course. We're going to focus a little bit more on it now, and we're going to break up this lecture into three different parts. So part A will be introducing again the concept of the theories of motor control, and we're going to specifically focus on what the terms are: coordination, the degrees of freedom problem, and we're going to relate that specific to what's called open and closed loop systems, and that will be part A. Part B will be on what we call motor programs theory, and part C will be on dynamical systems theory. So that's how we're going to, construct these three different lectures, or three different parts of this particular lecture. So this first one on motor control theories, the introduction of it, will go for about 5 or 6 minutes. So if we look firstly at the slide number 1, which is entitled Motor Control Theory, the two main terms we introduced to you in week 1, and we're describing in a bit more detail here, are the two terms coordination and degrees of freedom problem. And if we go to slide number 2, we go through what the actual definition of coordination is. And we know what it might be from trying to do an activity or be coordinated or produce a coordinated movement. But I guess by definition, we want to be really precise here and say coordination is the patterning of body and limb movements relative to the patterning of environmental objects and events. And we really want to consider the movement pattern of the skill in relation to a specific point in time, but also to the context of the environment of the head, body and limb movements. Now, what I used as well in week number 1 is I showed you this slide as well, which is slide number 2, looking at this angle diagram. It's a really good way to qualitatively assess a skill in relation to the movement pattern itself. And here we had the difference between a novice and a well-trained person producing a soccer kick. And the white dotted line was pre-practice and the black one was post-practice. So first of all, they did in this soccer kick, they compared well-trained people to novices. Then they trained novices for a period of time to see if their limb movement pattern actually changed. And what you can see here is on the y-axis, we've got knee flexion and extension, and on the x-axis, we've got hip extension and flexion, Now, we'll see there that this white actual line doesn't go very much vertically, doesn't really change from its original point that much. But you can see that as after practice, it changes quite a lot in that direction. So all we're saying here from this angle diagram is after training, there's much more flexion and extension in the knee when they're kicking. So they're less rigid and stiff, like poking at it, and they start to actually move the knee independently of the other parts of the lower leg. Now also to relation to hip flexion extension, we can see there's a lot more flexion and extension of the hip joint. Again, shows that we're releasing degrees of freedom. And that's just showing that with practice, even if the quantitative assessment, otherwise if they didn't kick any more goals or their scores didn't increase, by looking at these angle diagrams, we can see an actual change in the movement pattern. And in this particular thing, we're looking at the difference between the hip and the knee flexion extension of a soccer kick, and we see the differences from pre to post training. So a really good way of actually measuring changes in coordination in a qualitative way. Now the next slide, we start to introduce the concept of the degrees of freedom problem. So we've mentioned this too in week number 1. You've done this before in functional anatomy. So again, not trying to go over old ground, but here we've looked at a number of different ways that your limbs can move, a number of different directions. And when you're trying to produce a movement, there's a number of different ways that all your limbs could interact and go in different directions and movements. So we want to know, how does the central nervous system actually control the degrees of freedom to actually make a complex system act in a specific way? So we really want to know, how does this nervous system control and coordinate the muscles and limb to actually perform a skill as you intended to do? An example I gave also too in that first lecture was, for example, a joystick is a way to actually simplify and centralize all the different actions that you can do if you're playing a computer game. So instead of having a button to go up, a button to go down, a button to go left and a button to go right, the joystick enables you to control that more by making it easier. And the same thing happens, that the slide here has got a helicopter in it. It's the same thing with the helicopter pilot. Rather than having a button for all these different directions, they have a joystick which they can use, which they can solve that problem to be able to use all the different movements and control them. So we've got to work out a way, what is the best way that we can describe that the body interacts with the central nervous system to solve this degrees of freedom problem. Now, we're going to introduce the concept of open and closed loop systems here in slide number 4. And the things we're going to look at, the two specific tasks, are driving a car and throwing a dart. Now, if we look at part A, here it's got input then it's got perception, decision making, motor program initiation. So let's have a look at throwing a dart. Throwing a dart, you might have a competition where you're trying to hit 20 or triple 20 or double 20, trying to get the highest score possible. And so what you might say is, what am I going to do to throw that dart? I'm going to make a decision to actually, whatever it is I'm going to aim at, if I'm going to loop it, what my action's going to be, and then I'm going to execute throwing the dart. Now, because it happens very quickly, this is an example of what's called an open loop control. Because there's not enough time here. If as soon as you throw the dart, there's not enough time for feedback to interact to tell you to stop if you've done something wrong. So if I've thrown it too hard or too soft or too high or too low, by the time I let it go, there's not enough time for feedback to come and enable me to correct it. So we would say in part A, throwing a dart would be under what's called open loop system control. Now if we go to part B, here we look at driving a car. So in driving a car, I might be driving on the freeway, I might have a decision just to be staying in this lane, but I'm looking ahead and there might be a car that's going really slow, so I'm going to make a decision to go and change, indicate and change lanes and get to the faster lane so I can go. So I've made that decision, I'm about to, but then, right, just as I'm about to do it, I might get some feedback from my peripheral vision or the sound of a horn, because the car next to me, I maybe didn't see my blind side. So I was about to make that action, but they've told me by the horn, sound, or in my visual system that no, you need to stop and correct your movement, stay in your lane because you'll hit the car if you go there. And at first I didn't see that. So this is saying here in driving a car, there's enough time for feedback to occur. So therefore we would say it's what's called a closed loop control. Closed loop means there's time for feedback to enter into the system. So that's slide number 4, looking at open and closed loop systems. Now, if we look at closed loop systems directly here now, most theories on how we, control the nervous system and coordinate movement are based on these open and closed loop systems. Now, an example of closed loop system involving feedback would be an example would be a heater in the house. So in this situation here, you might have a heater, one of those central heatings where you might say, right, I'm going to control it so I want the temperature to be at 17 degrees. And it will heat or cool the room depending on the outside temperature to get it to 17 degrees. And as soon as it gets to that, it'll actually stop. The only time the heater or the cooler will then start again is someone opens the door, lets some cold or some warm air in, or the environment changes, there's a window where it opens, whatever it might be, so it will then interact again to get it down to 17 degrees. In other words, it uses feedback to constantly tell us what the temperature needs to be, right? And in relation to a closed loop system, it has 4 distinct components. It has what's called an executive, an effector, a reference of correctness, and an error signal. Now, if we look at slide number 6, we look at now open loop systems. Now, open loop systems have also an executor and effector, but the feedback and comparative measures are missing. So an example would be an alarm clock. So you might set your alarm clock for 6 o'clock in the morning, it's meant to be, but you accidentally set it for 6 p.m. I'm sure many of you have used those excuses for not handing an assignment or being late to class or missing class. The good old I set my alarm to PM instead of AM. We've all used it, let's be honest. But in this situation here, what we're saying is it's an open loop system because even though it's morning, you set the alarm for PM. So it doesn't know and it can't use feedback enough time to be able to tell you to change that alarm because it can only go on the information you've given it. Same thing with a set of traffic lights. If there's an accident, until someone comes to interact and change that, the traffic lights will continue their normal timing for green, orange and red, even though there might be a pile up in the middle of the intersection. So that's just an example here of what's called an open loop system. Now slide number 7 and 8 really are just telling us the role of movement time in this process. Now, we're looking at these first 2 movements, which is what's called a punch and a bat swing. In the punch, movement time is 40 milliseconds. In a bat swing, movement time is 100 milliseconds. And you can see in both of these situations here, these, pictures are showing us these things. Here might be your 3 different situations of stimulus identification and actually making a decision to perform a movement, and it might go all the way down here along the different systems. Then you might execute your movement, but then feedback has to come all the way back up here, back up to the top to be able to change your decision, to be able to actually change your movement pattern. So in 40 milliseconds, it doesn't have enough time, and it gets to down here. When the bat swing, it gets to 100 milliseconds. Again, there's not enough time for it to come all the way back around to the top. If we look at, in slide number 8, a tennis stroke, again, more time, but still not enough time to change our decision. So it's only when we get to about 300 milliseconds where there's enough time to get all the way back up to actually get enough time for feedback, and that's in relation to a tennis serve, which I've shown you before. So in these first sort of 8 or 9 slides, we're just showing you the role of open and closed loop systems, and specifically looking at the role of coordination and movement time. So in faster movements, there's no time for feedback until the movement is complete. Somewhat slower movements, a low amount of feedback, but it's for the slower continuous based movements or discrete skills with longer movement times, a greater combination of what they call ordered hierarchical loops, which means there's more time for feedback to occur. So that really explains just the first part of this particular lecture. The next part, part B, will be on, the next 2 parts will be on dynamical systems and motor programs theory.